Good morning,
Welcome.
judges.
Welcome. I am Anita Boyd. I am in the tab room working this round. Would you like time signals 3712?
I have a timer on this side, so I should be fine. Thank you.
Well, I have to time it anyway, so if you'll give me just a second to pull that up, I will start there. Okay. You do know you would keep your camera on, obviously, the entire time, and that you will stay at the end for speaker number 7 to question you.
Absolutely.
All right, whenever you're ready to begin, congratulations for making semifinals.
Bored of watching YouTube hours on end, I sat down on my couch last night with my brother and watched an old family classic, Family Feud on ABC News. However, after living with my brother for over 1 year in quarantine, I've realized that I know pretty much everything there is to know about family feuds. That is, however, until I saw the nation of Jordan. Because as Vox News explains on April 9th of 2021, feuds between the royal family of Jordan have extended past 4 decades. And although I knew about the conflicts that might occur among families, the scale of them was absolutely astounding. Because just 2 months ago, Jordan's prince Hamza, who is also the half-brother of current King Abdullah, led an attempted coup on the king. A huge problem for the nation, destabilizing both the family and the region entirely. But considering that the international community immediately rushed to King Abdullah's support, it's now become essential that the international community asks itself the following question. Will infighting among the royal family of Jordan continue? To which the unfortunate answer is absolutely, because the international community's support of King Abdullah has only expressed validation for the 3 causes of the coup. First, an iron-fisted monarch. Second, state-led repression. And third and finally, foreign policy animosity with Saudi Arabia. But the first, and perhaps most understandable reason as to why the coup in Jordan took place just 2 months ago is because the King Abdullah has far too much power in the nation. As the Washington Institute for Middle Eastern Policy explains, on April 5th of 2021, the biggest problem with King Abdullah is that he does virtually everything he wants in regards to the royal family. This can clearly be seen with the former Prince Hamza. Back in 1999, Prince Hamza was granted the title of Crown Prince, meaning that he would ascend King Abdullah's throne after he left the office. However, just 5 years later, Abdullah removed this designation and gave it to his very own son. And it's not just Prime Minister Hamza that's faced these issues. Just in 2017, King Abdullah also dismissed 2 other of his brothers because they didn't, quote unquote, like them. They were also holding extremely high military positions in the nation. And as BBC notes, on April 4th of 2021, this was one of the most important issues as to why Prince Hamza actually went out and led this coup. In a video released to the BBC, Prince Hamza noted that the, quote, repressive nature of King Abdullah's monarchy made it difficult for him to feel like he had a voice in the administration, which is why he ended up trying to overthrow the administration entirely. But because the international community, with nations like Saudi Arabia and the US, and organizations like the European Union, have come to the rapid support of King Abdullah, it's likely that he doesn't have any motivation to change his policies on a domestic scale, only brewing further turmoil among the royal family and causing more issues in the future. But it's not just feuds among the family that creates problems for a coup. It's also reasons to overthrow a government entirely, which in the case of Jordan is state-led repression. As Responsible Statecraft, an international think tank, explains on April 5th of 2021, one of the largest reasons for why Jordan has been going through so much turmoil in the past 2 decades and why King Hamza actually reached over to have a coup is because of the horrible economic and political situation the government has been placed in. Because of the iron-fisted monarchy mentioned earlier, Abdullah has virtually no checks and balances on his governing policy, which has led to the virtual downfall of the nation. Yet Prince Hamza cites that although all of these issues exist, King Abdullah has done virtually everything in his power to repress the people of Jordan from expressing their concerns. And tragically, the Human Rights Watch corroborates this conclusion on August 18th of 2020, explaining that in massive protests in the second half of the 2020 year, the Jordanian government actually took to arresting, harassing, and dissenting virtually every single journalist they could get their hands on, arresting dozens in just protests spanning simply 2 weeks. The biggest problem with repression like this is that the people of Jordan don't get a chance to speak their mind and express problems with the government, which Prince Hamza also shares a concern with, claiming that the government has been, quote, corrupt in the past several decades. But yet again, because the international community has come to the rapid support of King Abdullah, there's no reason for him to change his policies in the years going forward. And because of his past repression and future probable repression as well, there will be vast reasons for other people in the royal family to take to coups and other infighting to solve this problem. But it's not just domestic issues in Jordan that have led to the coup. It's also international involvement, explaining the third reason why the coup occurred in April of 2021, and also why infighting is likely to continue in the future. As the Middle East Eye elaborates on April 9th of 2021, the best way to understand this infighting is in the context of the nation of Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest regional powers in Jordan and an increasing harmful one to the nation. Currently, there's two big points of conflict between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The first is Jordan's support of the Palestinian group, which Saudi Arabia takes great problems with. And the second is their dissent from the Abraham Accords, the US-led efforts to have peace in the Middle East in the future. As the NDTV elaborates on June 13th of 2021, because Saudi Arabia has such large problems with the Jordanian government, and because they, as one of the biggest regional superpowers, think they have the ability to change Jordanian foreign policy, they've taken their own strategic measures to change this very policy, seen through the most recent coup. In fact, two of Prince Hamza's accomplishments, Basim Adwala and Sharif Zaid, were actually from the Saudi Arabian government. The first of which was actually a former court official and has hold joint Jordanian-Saudi citizenship. And the second, Sharif Zaid, who was a former Jordanian official, but now belongs in the administration of Mohammed bin Salman. Clearly, as Arab News elaborates on April 4th of 2021, because these issues among Saudi Arabia and Jordan will persist in the future because of approval from nations like the US and organizations like the EU, and because Saudi Arabia continues to hold a strong foothold in the region, it seems likely that Saudi Arabian influence will continue to brew problems in the region in the future. So, when returning to today's question, will infighting among the royal family of Jordan continue? The tragic answer to this question is absolutely, because international support of King Abdullah has expressed complicity with the three most common causes of the coup. First, an iron-fisted monarch. Second, state-led repression. And third and finally, foreign policy issues with Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Finally, I couldn't get it to unmute. Official time is 6:59. Okay, we will now have our first speaker cross-examined by contestant number 3691. And 3691, you do know you need to have your camera on the entire time that the cross-examination is happening. At the end of 1 minute, I will do this, and this is 30, and this is stop. Is that good?
So we have, just to clarify, 2 minutes for cross-ex, not 3?
2. It's
okay.
2 minutes for cross-ex.
Our staff and the draw room told us 3, so that's okay.
This is according to our chairman here. So cool. After that's 1 minute, 30, stop. Got it?
Yes, ma'am. All right.
Let me turn myself 1 second.
Take it in.
You can start.
You said in your introduction that these protests and attempted coups have obviously destabilized Jordan. But given that they've destabilized Jordan, wouldn't Abdullah seek to restabilize it, perhaps by appeasing his brother?
Actually, the reason why Jordan has been having destabilization for the past 2 decades is because the iron fisted monarch King Abdullah has refused to answer to the problems of the nation. In fact, the evidence from the Human Rights Watch in my second point elaborates that because King Abdullah is so disconnected from his people and the problems of the nation, they continue to grow upon themselves while Abdullah remains in power.
But the question isn't whether or not Jordan's going to see more political infighting. It's about whether specifically the royal family will continue to fight. So if he appeases his brother, wouldn't the royal family infighting stop?
The problem is that Abdullah sees absolutely no reason to appease other royal family members. This is even the first piece of evidence in my first point, indicating that not only has Abdullah wronged other officials in the past, but also that in 2017, when he dismissed 2 of his very own brothers from the military administration, they simply fell in line, and Abdullah did absolutely nothing to appease them. This past track record indicates that even in the future, Abdullah is unlikely to appease any other individual in the royal family to have any political gain.
Sounds good. All right, moving on then to your third point in particular. Back in your first point, you mentioned that countries in the international community, including, and you listed Saudi Arabia, had pushed for the legitimacy of the existing government in Jordan. So why are they so angry with Jordan? Wouldn't that boost their relationship, thus stopping fighting with Saudi Arabia if Abdullah knows he has Saudi's support?
The problem with Saudi Arabia's foreign policy towards Jordan is that it's two-faced. The public image endorsed by Mohammed bin Salman is that he supports the Jordanian government. Yet it's the subconscious and under the surface efforts as seen through the 2 individuals in the Saudi administration helping Prince Hamza that actually efforts to destabilize Jordan. And because of this two-faced approach, it's likely that's going to continue.
All right, thank you very much. All right, I will see y'all in about 30 minutes.
Hey, I'm
Welcome.
Natasha. Oh, hi, I'm Natasha.
Welcome. 3657.
That's me.
Congratulations on making semis. You have a speaker 3712 in the room to observe and then to ask questions and cross-examination at the end. Do you need time signals?
I do not. If it's all right with y'all, I'll be timing myself.
That's fine. But I have to do it officially, so you may start.
Okay, so y'all don't need the question in the chat? You'll just hear it in my speech? Or you type, okay.
Put the,
Okay, there you go. All right, I'll assume y'all are ready and get started. It's no secret that the Olympics were canceled last summer, but this might actually be a great opportunity for other sports to have their moment in the limelight. Take fencing, for example. There's two objectives to the game. You have to wear a mask and use a stick to keep people away from you. It's perfect for our current situation. But while it seems as if the sports industry has effectively adapted to COVID-19, it's no secret that countries around the world have faced difficulty in responding to the virus. But for countries like Lebanon, they were facing an economic and humanitarian crisis even before the pandemic. Because what Reuters tells us on March 10th of 2020 is that Lebanon has one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the entire world, with a debt of over $90 billion. And considering that the Human Rights Watch told us this time on January 10th of 2020, that as a result of this economic difficulty, we have seen a rise in unrest and violence within the country, it's absolutely essential that we ask ourselves today's question: how can Lebanon address its ongoing economic crisis? And the answer is clear. They need more effective government initiatives to target the crisis. More specifically, first is by stabilizing the currency. Second is by taking steps in order to expand a social safety net. And finally is to address government inefficiencies. The currency is actually the heart of a majority of the crisis in Lebanon. And that's exactly why the first way that we can alleviate the economic crisis in Lebanon is by stabilizing the currency. This time, if we look to an article from the Associated Press, they explain on June 8th of 2021 how right now the Lebanon currency has lost a lot of its value. In fact, as a result of that, it's declined by more than 80% in the past year. And as a result of this, we've seen major economic implications. More specifically, there's been a dramatic rise in food prices within the country, largely because insofar as the currency is devalued, imports from other countries become very, very expensive for the residents. For example, the price of 2 pounds of meat with red meat in the country corresponds to around 43 US dollars. Unfortunately, this has resulted in many people not being able to access basic necessities. However, there is a potential to address this, because what The Economist explains in its issue from April of this year is that recently the government announced an initiative in order to limit capital outflows. In other words, it restricts the ability of Lebanese residents from taking out their foreign currency from banks and transferring it to other banks. As a result of this ensures that the foreign currency reserves in the country remain stable. Now, the next step for the Lebanese government is to take advantage of these foreign currency reserves by selling them and buying their own currency. This essentially stabilizes the exchange rate for the Lebanese currency and prevents this sort of devaluation from occurring so substantially. But of course, in the short term, the Lebanese people need support, and that can come in the form of a social safety net, bringing us to the second way that Lebanon can address its ongoing economic crisis, is through expanding the social safety net. What the Business Insider reports on August 11th of 2021 is that as a result of skyrocketing unemployment in places like Lebanon, it mitigates consumer spending, especially when it comes to generating tax revenue for the federal government. Unfortunately, this makes it difficult for the government to do things like pay off its skyrocketing debt, making it clear that expanding the social safety net to some extent is definitely a step in the right direction. Because insofar as a report from the World Bank tells us from January 2021, that the unemployment rate within the country is over 6%, it's clear that millions are not able to access basic necessities being jobless, and hence, for the short term at least, they should receive unemployment benefits from the government so they can continue contributing to the economy as they continue to try and get back on their feet. But unfortunately, ever since the 1900s, government mismanagement has exacerbated the economic crisis in the country. And that brings us to the final way that Lebanon can address its economic crisis, is by mitigating these sorts of government inefficiencies. Because if we look to The Guardian, they tell us in November of this year that the problem right now with the government is that we have high amounts of embezzlement, as well as things like political grafting, in which essentially we have politicians buying the votes of their constituents. And this is a pretty big deal, because what Reuters explains in that same article from March 10th of 2020 is that over time, we've actually seen public spending from the government increase substantially. Back in the early 2000s, the government public spending was around $6 billion. But in 2016, it's bumped up all the way to $13 billion, demonstrating how the government is engaging in substantial spending, but it doesn't seem to be actually going towards supporting the people. Hence making it clear that the country needs to establish an effective mechanism of enforcing and investigating these sorts of financial violations by politicians, such as through the establishment of a special investigation commission in order to investigate these allegations and also disincentivize future ones from politicians. Taking these sorts of steps is going to be a long-term initiative, but for the long term, it can prevent this sort of ineffective government spending, which makes it difficult for the country to, again, pay off its debt. By taking care of this, it can actually bolster Lebanon substantially, because instead of going into debt restructuring and defaulting on its debt, Lebanon becomes more capable of paying off its debt independently. And that means it can incentivize more things like foreign direct investment from more developed nations like the European Union, for example. In the long term, this can help develop production infrastructure within the country to further revitalize its economy. So, when looking back at today's question, how can Lebanon address its ongoing economic crisis? The answer is clear. They need to engage in more substantial government initiatives. First is by stabilizing the currency. Second, expanding social safety nets. And finally, is by taking steps towards addressing government inefficiencies. So it's clear that while Lebanon might be facing a devastating economic crisis right now, taking these sorts of steps can change that.
Thank you. Official time is 6:55.
Right.
Okay, as we begin the cross-examination period, our second speaker and our second speaker will now be examined by 3712. If it's okay, I'm going to do, after 1 minute, this, and when a minute and a half, this, and then this is stop at 2. Is that good?
Sounds great.
Okay. Let me mute myself.
Great speech. I just have a few questions for you. In your first point, you claim that the best way to stabilize the currency is by selling foreign currency reserves and buying Lebanon's own currency. But considering that you indicate in your first point that these foreign currency belongs to Lebanese residents rather than the Lebanese government, how can the Lebanese government acquire this foreign currency and sell it?
Again, so the issue with this argument is just basically having that foreign currency supply within the country, which can be utilized in order to buy these reserves. We're not saying that they would necessarily take the supply that the residents have, but rather just having that supply within the country ensures that they have that possibility of buying the Lebanese lira.
Right. So I understand that having the possibility to buy foreign currency is valuable, but I don't understand exactly if foreign currency is simply sitting in Lebanese banks, how that impacts the Lebanese lira. So how exactly would that work?
Right. So what happens with these capital outflows, when these countries essentially take foreign currency, or rather they take Lebanese currency and translate it to foreign currency, for example, by essentially losing, or the demand of the Lebanese currency goes down. And as a result of that, we see more devaluation of the currency. In this regard, we see the opposite happening by preventing capital outflows and by preventing residents from essentially selling their Lebanese liras.
Perfect. In your second point, you claim that expanding the social safety net is a great economic tool to help the economy. While I understand it's essential for the people of Lebanon to get the help that they need, I'm confused how the government's giving more money to the Lebanese people in the hopes of them spending it back and tax revenue would actually help the Lebanese government. Considering you're indicating in your background that Lebanon already has one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the region and in the world.
Again, so the question is not just increasing economic spending, but increasing it in an efficient and effective manner. What I talk about in my point is using it very specifically to address the humanitarian crisis facing these people. Not engaging, I'm not saying that the government should become entirely austere to address its economic crisis, but rather in the short term, they should have this mechanism in place to mitigate the current economic crisis.
Thank you very much. And thank you all judges for judging today. Have a great day.
Hello, I'm Pranav. I'm the next speaker today.
Congratulations, contestant 3584 for making it to the semifinal round. I am part of the tab staff that will be helping in the room. Do you need time signals?
I should be able to time myself. I'll keep the timer right here on the side. That's fine.
That's fine. I'll keep the official time.
Okay.
But but I won't give you signals if you want to do your own thing.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay, 1 second, please.
Yeah.
Let me mute myself, and as I do that, now speaker 3657, you do not have to have your camera on. You can during his speech. You can. That's fine. But you do need to have it on during your questioning. So I'm going to mute myself, and then you can begin.
Can he put the question into the chat, please?
Yeah, absolutely. There it is.
I think you're good to go.
Okay, sounds good. And just before I get started, can you hear and see me well at this range? Just checking. You can? Sounds great. Okay. A few years ago, when Iran had their most recent round of elections, we saw that the turnout in the country was almost a massive 75%. Now, if that many people voted in the United States, it would still come down to 38 people in Florida. Because when we see this issue of turnout at elections, while we're seeing a new election finally come, some of the issues from those past elections are still the same, especially the issue of diplomacy and nuclear negotiations. In fact, BBC explains an article just half an hour ago about the elections that are occurring today in Iran, about the presidential situation. Because the article tells us that right now, these kinds of presidential elections are set to most likely elect Ibrahim Raisi to be the new president of Iran, given the fact that these elections have effectively been rigged by the government. Now, Raisi is an individual who's a hardliner and the current head of the judiciary. As the Foreign Policy magazine notes just an hour ago, that this comes right at the time when Iran is negotiating with the rest of the world in terms of creating a new nuclear deal and removing a lot of sanctions that have been placed on the country. And considering that when Iran has recently reached a 60% enrichment level for its nuclear uranium as a whole, and that Iran could once again be on the path to a bomb, it is our basic responsibility to ask, will Iran's elections provide a more diplomatic approach to its leadership? The answer is absolutely not, because the new president Raisi is going to take a more hardline approach. First, specifically in terms of nuclear negotiations. Second, because of his past direct role in human rights violations. And lastly, because of his focus and his likelihood of maintaining aggressiveness in regional relations. Now, when it comes to Iran and the United Nations, a few years ago, Iran was actually invited to the UN Conference on Nuclear Disarmament. In related news, Russia was invited to the UN Conference on Human Rights. But that leads to the first main reason as to why, on the whole, these elections don't provide a more diplomatic approach to Iran's leadership, which is because of the fact that specifically, we're seeing the Iranian government likely become even more hardline on nuclear negotiations with the new president, Mr. Raisi. Now, that's further explained to us by Al Monitor, a local news site just 3 days ago, that specifically in terms of Iran and nuclear negotiations, we've seen that a lot of the power has been given towards the current supreme leader of the country, Ayatollah Khamenei, to set foreign and economic policy. And so he had to be the one that approved the past deals and past negotiations. But now he's also the one that's directly taking charge in the government in order to make sure the government is having a hardline stance in diplomacy, that the government will not allow the West to impose many restrictions on the government unless the West actually gives a lot of concessions to Iran first. Now, that's the current policy. But even the new president is not going to change that or provide a more diplomatic approach. Because as the Foreign Policy magazine further explains to us just 3 days ago as well, that with Raisi in power, what we have to note is that Raisi is an individual who's allegedly wanting to become the next supreme leader of Iran. Therefore, he's acted in a way that's pretty cozy with the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And he said, for example, in the presidential debates that have happened, that he's likely to actually defer a lot to the specific supreme leader of the country. Given the fact that the supreme leader is an individual who is already a hardliner himself, allowing him to have so much control over nuclear policy means the government won't need to have, or rather won't have, a more diplomatic approach to its leadership, meaning that Iran could once again be on the path to the bomb. But when it comes to human rights, after allegations that Iran had killed its own citizens, the government of Iran said absolutely not, and that anybody who spread those allegations would be faced with demise. Because it's always a good idea to deny murder by threatening death. But that leads us to the second main reason as to why, on the whole, the government of Iran will not be seeing a more diplomatic approach with these new elections, which is because of the fact that on human rights, Ibrahim Raisi has been an individual who's been directly involved in these violations. Now, that's further explained to us by Amnesty International in a report from 2020 about the human rights situation in Iran. That Iran as a country, because it's so authoritarian, is one where human rights violations have been extremely common. For example, with political executions, torture, and the killings of lots of individuals who have dissented against the government. That's why we've seen, for example, that the West has called on Iran to improve a lot of its human rights as part of some of these negotiations that have happened. And the fact that Iran hasn't agreed to this is a reason as to why diplomacy hasn't been too great. But the problem is, with Iran's elections now leading to Ibrahim Raisi becoming president, we're not going to be seeing a more diplomatic approach in this regard either. Because as Radio Free Europe further explains to us just 5 days ago, that with Ibrahim Raisi, what we have to note is that he was directly involved in the killing of political prisoners, actually ordering the executions of many of them when he was the head of the judiciary. That's why in 2019, after ordering some of these executions, the United States and the European Union directly put sanctions on him. Now that he's the leader of the country, he's not going to be seeing a more conciliatory or taking a more conciliatory approach on human rights. And because this has been a barrier to diplomacy, it shows us that Iran's elections won't provide a more diplomatic approach to leadership at all. Now, many people have said Iran's elections have been chaotic, delayed, and frustrating, which explains their official sponsor, Spirit Airlines. But especially when it comes to elections, it's really important to look at the specific aspect of aggressiveness with regional neighbors, which is the third and final reason as to why the new elections are not going to provide a more diplomatic approach. And that's further explained to us today by the Council on Foreign Relations in a 2019 report about the past aggressiveness that the government used to have, specifically focusing on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, which is a specific wing of their military that's been involved in regional aggression. For example, attacking military bases from regional countries, as well as supporting regional militant groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthi rebels. And so the West in diplomatic negotiations has called on Iran consistently to reduce that kind of support to the IRGC and to be less aggressive using this paramilitary wing within the region as a whole. But the problem is Ibrahim Raisi is likely to make that situation worse. As the Radio Free Europe explains to us on April 10th of 2021, that specifically in terms of Ibrahim Raisi's approach, he's an individual that's been really close towards the IRGC. For example, he has a lot of trust and relationships with the current IRGC commander, Hossein Salami. And that trust means he's likely to allow them to continue being aggressive in the region. Since that's been a reason as to why the government has not been diplomatic before, it shows us that the Iranian government isn't going to be more diplomatic in the region, and that Iranian aggression is only going to continue. So in coming back to today's question, will Iran's elections provide a more diplomatic approach to its leadership? The answer is absolutely not. First, when it comes to these nuclear negotiations. Second, on human rights. And lastly, because of the failures on regional aggression. So while the government of Iran might have done pretty well with turnout before, it's important that the West realizes the situations are only getting worse. Thank you.
Thank you. The official time is 7:15.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, if you'll let me get started here for the other one. Okay. I will hold up a finger at 1. I will hold up this at a half, and this is stop in your question period.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to mute myself, and then you may begin.
Great. Congratulations on a great speech. Just have a couple of questions. So we'll start off on your first point. So you discussed the idea of the nuclear negotiations and such. So considering the fact that these economic sanctions, like you mentioned, have crippled Iran's economy in the past, isn't it likely that this particular president, potential candidate, Ibrahim Raisi, is likely to come to the negotiating table specifically just to get the sanctions relief?
So there's two main things. These sanctions have been placed for the past 3 years, and that hasn't led to any kinds of negotiations being successful. And second, Iran is at the negotiating table, but the problem is they're taking a pretty obstructionist approach. The fact is that sanctions have been there for a while, and that isn't changing that approach at all.
Yeah, but don't we have to consider the fact that the new president of the US, President Biden, is going to take a more aggressive approach to getting getting this deal passed? Isn't it likely he'll be willing to come to the negotiating table because of that?
Right, but it's important to consider that Biden has also added some specific stances to his position. For example, he's called on Iran to be less aggressive within the region. He's called on Iran to have serious restrictions on their nuclear program as well. And those are things that Iran hasn't agreed to. Remember the fact that we've had this Biden administration for multiple months now. And if that was the case, then we would have seen an Iran nuclear deal already. That hasn't happened.
Okay, and then continuing on that same question, when it comes to considering the fact that on the campaign trail, Raisi has already indicated that he's willing to meet with President Biden just as a beginning discussion, doesn't that already indicate his willingness to engage in diplomacy?
Right, but it's important to consider that we have President Rouhani as well in the current government that has already had negotiations with the US government in Vienna. So those negotiations are happening. This is not something that Raisi is going to uniquely bring in. So at that point, it doesn't create a new diplomatic relationship with the rest of the world, but rather it's important to consider that Raisi as an individual who's wanting to defer to the supreme leader to get that position later is going to allow for the supreme leader to continue his hardline aggressive stances, meaning no nuclear deal and potentially an Iranian bomb.
All right, yeah, so I understand that. But when considering the fact that these negotiations, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, you can see and hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. My screen is frozen. I can see me, but I can see everyone, but you're frozen in action. So I just wanted to make sure you could see me. We welcome our next contestant, 3730.
That is correct. I have my question copied, so would you like me to just throw that into the chat?
Please, that would be great. Do you need time signals?
I do. Let me quickly just go grab my phone so I can time myself as well.
Okay.
So I have my phone off to the right, so I'll be timing myself. But just for time signals, can I get 5 down and a C at 30?
Yes.
Perfect. Alrighty, and just for everybody else watching who doesn't have access to the chat, the question is Egypt the key to leadership in the Middle East? Awesome. So if I can just get a thumbs up from all my judges when you are ready, that'll be perfect. Awesome.
You may begin.
Recently in the Middle East, it was found that the 5 most common phrases said by Middle Eastern men are translated to hi, hello, nice to meet you, good evening, and death to America. A clear representation of the anti-American sentiment that proliferates across the region. But it's not just that. Stabilization problems in the Middle East have raged rampant for several years now, causing significant crises across the region. Moreover, the Yemeni civil war, the Iraq war, the Syria war, and even the everlasting problem of Israel versus Palestine caused significant crises in the Middle East across the region. Considering that Egypt has been recently one of the most stable Middle Eastern North African nations, and bearing in mind that over 500,000 lives have been lost due to crises in the Middle East, and the United Nations explains that almost 60% are a direct result of international crisis, it becomes pertinent we ask today's essential question. Is Egypt key to leadership in the Middle East? And the answer is that fortunately, they are. First, because Egypt possesses effective sanctioning power. Second, because they're best equipped to provide aid. And finally, perhaps most importantly, they have shown their ability to broker peace deals. If there's one most essential lesson of all economics class, is that every economy in the world is interconnected, indicating the first reason why Egypt is key to leadership in the Middle East is because they possess effective sanctioning power. The Center for Strategic and International Studies explained on November 20th, 2020, that when it comes to crises in the Middle East, almost 99% of the arms coming to the region directly come from the nation of China. Moreover, The Guardian furthered this argument on September 24th, 2020, by explaining that oftentimes these arms directly land in the hands of innocent people, and the triggers are causing more violence within the region, demonstrating that not only are there significant international arms sales coming from China, but they also directly lead to violence, demonstrating exactly why Egypt is best equipped to handle leadership within the region. And that's because they possess effective sanctioning power. Al Jazeera wrote on June 5th, 2021, that recently, President al-Sisi of Egypt has publicly proclaimed that he's ready to place significant sanctions on China. But what's different is that he wants to do it effectively, in a lucrative approach. Instead of simply placing sanctions on Chinese industries, that would be economically bad for almost everyone involved, he's actually placing sanctions on supplementary goods, like fuel for tanks or ammunition for guns, effectively having the same approach, but having less economic backlash, demonstrating that not only can he set a precedent to the region, but he can also effectively reduce the number of arms sales, lessening violence, and helping the Middle East as a whole by creating itself as a global leader in the Middle East. If there's one thing that every human can agree on across the world, it's that the value of human life is the most precious element of our well-being, indicating the second reason why Egypt is best equipped to be a new leader in the Middle East is primarily because it is best equipped to provide aid. Moreover, Richard Haas, president of Council on Foreign Relations, explains in his most recent book, The World, an introduction to it, that oftentimes in Middle Eastern conflicts and crisis, we find that goods like food, water, shelter, and sanitation become significantly scarce in the region, and that directly leads to more problems. In fact, the Brookings Institution found in a study done throughout the year of 2020 that over 52 million individuals are starving in Yemen alone. And UNICEF quantified in the same study done throughout the year of 2020 that when it looked towards Middle Eastern nations, they ranked the lowest in terms of sanitation across the entire globe. demonstrating that not only are these goods important to human lives, but the scarcity of it is causing significant problems. But Egypt is best equipped to provide aid and help solve this problem for two specific reasons. That's why we look towards an article published by the Times of Israel just 3 days ago, in which it explains that Egypt already provides over 14 million pounds of aid to Israel alone. And not only does Egypt possess the sheer size of aid, but they're also more closer to the region. And that proximity possesses a key advantage. That's why Professor Greensberg of the MIT explains in a study done throughout the month of March of 2020 that when it comes to proximity, Egypt not only provides a huge amount of aid, but they're closer, making them the best equipped to provide aid, setting precedent for other countries in the region to help solve the problems that cause more violence and lack of sanitation, food, water, and shelter, making them a key leader to the Middle East. Recently, in Middle Eastern countries, it was found that there aren't too many Walmarts there, probably because there's a Target at every corner, indicating the third and final reason why Egypt is best equipped to be the leader in the Middle East right now is because they can effectively and have shown their ability to broker peace deals. When we look towards the same book published by Richard Haass, President of Council on Foreign Relations, he explains that in issues like Israel and Palestine, the everlasting problems can only be solved through either big peace deals or smaller compromises and ceasefires. Moreover, a study done by an article published by The Economist just last week explains that when it comes to these problems, the reason why a peace deal is essential is because ethnic and religious cleavages rage rampant across the Middle Eastern countries. And that's exactly why Egypt is best equipped to help broker peace deals and ceasefires in the region. Moreover, we find that because of these significant cleavages, peace deals and ceasefires are the best solution for long-term peace. And Egypt can do this best. That's why we look towards an article published by The Hill on June 7th, 2021, in which they explained that just a couple months ago, on May 21st, Egypt effectively brokered a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. That's the most recent example of a success for Egypt. Moreover, just a week later, they changed the game by hosting an international diplomacy meeting between the Israel leaders and the Hamas leaders, demonstrating that they're not stopping just at ceasefires, but they want to reach peace deals, showing that in the past, not only have they been able to successfully broker ceasefires and peace deals, but they're the best equipped to do so, setting precedent in the region and showing why they are a key leadership to the Middle East. So when we take a step back and ask today's pertinent question, is Egypt key to leadership in the Middle East? The answer is a fortunate yes. First, because they possess effective sanctioning power. Second, because Egypt is best equipped to provide aid. And finally, perhaps most importantly, they've shown their ability to broker peace deals. So while Middle Eastern men might be saying death to America, perhaps they might have better hopes with the country of Egypt. Awesome. Can I get a quick time on that? Oh, I think you're muted. I'm not sure if it's my computer or...
I want to make sure the two of you can hear and see me. I can't see, I can see you, but you're frozen. So I just want to make sure you can see and hear me as I give you time signals.
Yeah, I could see your time signals.
Okay. All right, for this next part, speaker number 3584 will cross-examine you, and you will have 2 minutes. At 1 minute, I will hold this finger, then at 1.5, and then at 2. Is that good?
Sounds perfect.
Okay. Nita, we need the time on the last speech.
6:55. Sorry, I was
you.
muted. I feel it's hard to juggle all of this at the same time. All right, I'm going to mute myself, and then you guys can begin the question period.
Congrats on a great speech. Just a couple questions. So when it comes to Egypt, is Egypt a major market that China generally relies on?
No, I would say that Egypt is significant to the region and its economic prominence, and so is China. That's why in my first argument, I explained why Egypt can effectively place sanctions on it to reduce violence.
Okay. So is Egypt that important of a market for China that Egypt suddenly has leverage over a country that has an economy like 20 times larger than the economy of Egypt as a whole?
When it comes to placing sanctions on countries, you don't necessarily need to be brokering and working directly with China. Sanctions can work in several locations, demonstrating directly why Egypt can still place sanctions on China and still have the same approach, in the end, reducing violence.
Right, but for sanctions to succeed, you have to get the other country to do something differently, right? But if Egypt has very, very little leverage over China, how are they going to be able to suddenly change China's policies in the region, especially arms, which you said is so important?
And that's a great point, but I think you're making a very significant assumption here, that Egypt and China don't trade a lot. And that's a big problem, because they do, and they are very connected when it comes to the Middle East, demonstrating why they do actually have significant leverage over China and arm sales in the region.
Okay, let's go all the way to your third point. You talk about the success of the recent Israel-Hamas peace deal that Egypt brokered, right? But just yesterday, Israel announced new rocket attacks against Hamas after Hamas launched incendiary balloons into Israel. So doesn't that indicate that Egypt hasn't been that successful in peace deals because the one they most recently brokered didn't even work at all?
I think it would be naive to assume that a single ceasefire can solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. That problem is going to proliferate for a long time, no matter how many peace deals or ceasefires are passed. But that's why taking smaller steps, as I indicated in my third point, would help solve the solution in the longer term.
So if the smaller steps that they did take didn't work, how are they the key to leadership then, though?
I think passing a cease deal.
Students taking the bus for transportation are dismissed at this time.
I apologize, I'm out of school. Would you like me to continue? I didn't have the time on that. I'll just finish up the sentence that I was saying. I think that the ceasefires that they have actually promoted in the region can directly lead to less violence and help broker peace deals in the long term, directly leading to why they're important to leadership in the Middle East.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So for the next speaker, would you like me to turn my camera off while they're speaking, or how would you guys like me to do that?
I'll leave that up to the judges. Judges, do you have a preference?
I have no problem with them staying on.
Okay, that's fine. So let's wait for our next contestant. Oh, we have our next contestant that is here. Contestant number 3571 is your next speaker. Can you see me and hear me?
I can, very clearly.
Okay, thank you. Do you need time signals?
I do not. I'll be keeping time on my own, and I am on airplane mode.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to keep official time, but I will not give you signals then.
All right, sounds good. And before I start, I'll put my question in the chat for y'all. It's a little lengthy. Which countries in the Middle East can most influence the region towards economic cooperation, or rather towards greater economic cooperation?
Okay, I'm going to mute myself, and you may go with a thumbs up or at your will.
All right, there are a lot of judges, so if you're not ready, can you let me know? Otherwise, I'll assume that you are. All right, see, notice end. If you ever get the chance to visit Iran, you'll find yourself confronted with some unorthodox restaurant choices. Because Iran bans American fast food, Iranians have had to get creative. If you're hungry for a burger, well, McDonald's is right around the corner. And if pizza is more your style, well, there's a Pizza Hut just 2 blocks away. But all jokes aside, Iran's policy is a sign of just how divided the Middle East has become, as ideological differences contribute to economic isolationism. The International Monetary Fund writes in November of 2020 that this problem has become even more clear after COVID-19, with travel and tourism restrictions isolating the region further and contributing to a projected 12% decrease in GDP growth over the next 5 years. Given the high stakes, economic integration across the region is vital because we know that economic cooperation can serve as a bridge to political and violent stability. That's why people across the Middle East are asking a key question. Which countries in the Middle East can most influence the region towards greater economic cooperation? The answer, paradoxically, is those most entrenched in the region's conflicts, Because quite simply, they have the most room to grow. More specifically, 3 countries in particular hold this potential. First, Iran, because of their escape from sanctions. Second, Israel, because of their normalization. And finally, Saudi Arabia, because of their diversification. Let's first take a look at the nation of Iran, the home of McDonald's and Pizza Hut, and also one of the most isolated in the Middle East. As Reuters explains, literally 10 minutes ago, Iran recently held a presidential election in which they elected a new hardliner to office. But that doesn't matter because real power in Iran rests with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, who has come under pressure recently to renew the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal as it's more popularly known. The time to renew the JCPOA is ripe, as Reuters continues that the arrival of President Biden in office signals optimism on both sides. Moreover, Reuters writes that there's extreme pressure on Ayatollah Khomeini right now because inflation and unemployment have skyrocketed in the nation as sanctions have devastated Iran's oil economy, leading to a more than 90% drawdown in their amount of oil exports. Should Iran and the US agree on the deal, as Reuters concludes they are likely to do, it would lead to a new era of economic cooperation for Iran. The Congressional Research Service writes in April of 2021 that as part of their sanctions package and regime, the United States imposed strict sanctions on Iran's banking industry, cutting off access to the US dollar as a currency of trade and effectively isolating them from the rest of countries in the Middle East. Those sanctions make it extremely difficult to do business in Iran, for instance, cutting off investment from other nations. So, as those sanctions disappear with a renewed JCPOA, it becomes increasingly more likely that Iran can influence the region towards economic cooperation, using its vast oil reserves to drive energy security, and moreover, cooperating with nations that it hasn't had a chance to before. Next, let's take a look at a hotbed of violence within the Middle East, that is, Israel, and see how the second country posed to promote economic cooperation in the region is Israel because of their normalization efforts. The Brookings Institution contextualizes in November of 2020 that Israel has long had poor relationships with many Arab nations in the Middle East, going to war with them several times in the 20th century over the situation of Palestine. More recently, however, the Brookings Institution writes, these Arab nations have chosen to overlook the suffering of Palestinians in favor of their own economic goals. Last year, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain both signed on to normalization deals with Israel as part of the so-called Abraham Accords, ushering in a new era of economic and diplomatic cooperation between that triad. Moreover, as the Times of Israel writes just 3 days ago, Israel now has a new government with a ruling coalition replacing the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, a hard right-wing leader who in the past had opposed these sorts of normalization deals and stronger relations with Arab nations because of his position on Palestine. This new ruling coalition is the first in Israel's history to include an Arab party, and by using their influence in the government, they can push Israel towards stronger relationships with other Arab nations, including investment and trade. For further evidence, the Times of Israel offers Israel's new foreign minister, Yair Lapid, who recently met with leaders from Morocco, Egypt, Bahrain, and the UAE as part of a new push to build economic cooperation with these new leaders. As Israel moves to become closer to its neighbors, both in military and diplomatic terms, it seems that economic ties will surely follow. Finally, let's examine Saudi Arabia, one of the nation's most puzzling and complex nations when it comes to their international relations. The final country posed to promote economic cooperation in the region is Saudi Arabia because of their economic diversification. As the Atlantic Council explains, in August of 2020, Saudi Arabia has long had an economy focused solely on oil, but their leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has been trying to move away from that platform with what he calls the Vision 2030 initiative. This program, designed to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy and build the private sector, has set a goal of 25% growth in the private sector over time. But MBS realizes that he can't accomplish this goal on his own. Foreign Policy magazine explains in January of 2021 that as part of this liberalization, he's reached out to former enemies, for instance, the nation of Qatar, who he recently imposed a blockade on, but then lifted the blockade because he knows he needs Qatar as a partner. through what is called the Gulf Cooperation Council, a group of countries in the Gulf dedicated to energy security and economic performance. MBS can build the economy of Saudi Arabia using foreign investment as its engine. Overall, as we return to the question, which countries in the Middle East can most influence the region towards greater economic cooperation? The answer is, strangely, those most entrenched in the region's conflict, because they have the most room to grow. That breaks down to first, Iran, because of their escape from sanctions. Second, Israel, because of their normalization process. And finally, Saudi Arabia, because of their economic diversification. It seems that at the end of the day, McDonald's and Pizza Hut won't survive in Iran much longer.
Official time is 7:01. At this point, contestant number 3730 will question you. I will give you a one after 1 minute. This is the half, 1.5, and then this is stop. Is that okay with both of you?
That's okay.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself and you may begin.
Awesome. Thank you for that great speech. I just have a couple questions for you. Let's first talk about your first argument, where you referenced the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal. You tell us that Iran trying to revitalize such a deal can lead to more economic cooperation. But the question's asking about economic cooperation in the Middle East. How does reviving a deal with the United States lead to Middle Eastern cooperation?
As I explained, part of this sanctions package includes sanctions on the financial sector in Iran's central bank, which prevents Middle Eastern nations from conducting transactions in US dollars. By freeing up the global reserve currency as a means of conducting transactions, lifting those sanctions would give Middle Eastern nations many more options when it comes to engaging with Iran.
Awesome. Continuing that argument about JCPOA, I have a question about how it will actually impact economic sectors. As you know, the JCPOA is indicated to try to reduce the nuclearization of Iran in the first place. How would that directly lead to more economic stability in the region?
Well, when Iran isn't a nuclear threat, countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, are more likely to engage because they don't view them as a military adversary.
Great. Let's move on to your second point. When you talk about Israel, in your second point, you directly talk about how Israel is trying to normalize relations with other Arab countries. Considering that, you explain to us how they can normalize relations militarily and diplomatically. How would that directly lead to more economic cooperation?
As part of the Abraham Accords, they also signed memorandums of understanding that facilitate trade and investment as part of that diplomatic process.
So when we're talking about the nation of Israel and how they're normalizing diplomatic relations, do you think that will necessarily lead to more cooperation across the Middle East, or just more militarily in terms of other trade and deals like the Abraham Accords?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but it will lead to more economic integration because they're trading and investing in nations that they didn't have ties with before.
Once again, great speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ash.
Thank you so much. Our next contestant is number 3655. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You do know that contestant number 3571 is in the room to observe and then question you at the end.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you need time signals?
If you're okay with me timing myself, that'd be great.
That's fine.
Perfect.
Okay, as long as your judges are ready, I'm going to mute myself and you may begin.
Perfect. When asked what he thought about the diversity in Saudi Arabian government, a Saudi Arabian news reporter responded, there was plenty of diversity. There was older men, middle-aged men, and younger men. And while that may not be what diversity actually is, it seems that diversity and rights towards women in the country of Saudi Arabia are finally being put back into the spotlight of the Saudi Arabian government. Because, as Independent News explains, on June 12th of this year, a groundbreaking law was finally passed in Saudi Arabia that allowed women to live alone for the first time in the country's history, albeit if they were divorced or widowed. And while some people criticize this as not going far enough, considering that in 2019, the first law was passed in a series of actions that allowed women to travel without the guardianship of a male, this law is undeniably being pushed as a newfound right towards women. But when considering that critics around the world for human rights and basic international equity have challenged this law, saying it simply does not do enough for equality in Saudi Arabia, it becomes essential to ask, is Saudi Arabia's law permitting women to live alone without approval of a male guardian a step forward in women's rights? And the answer undeniably is yes, because this action finally gives pathways towards increasing equality for women in regard to violence. But that can be explained by first, it gives women a pathway in domestic abuse. Then second, because it finally increases opportunity for divorce. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is it sets a standard for international policy. Now, growing up, children are often told that all they have is family. And while that is a positive notion here in the United States, the unfortunate reality is that in Saudi Arabia, that notion is actually quite terrifying. And that's the exact first reason why this law is finally a step forward for women's rights, because it allows women to escape violence in domestic abuse. As Gulf News writes, on June 9th of this year, the International Press Secretary, Mariam Al-Atabi, was sued by her own father in 2018 after her attempt to live alone in the country of Saudi Arabia. But following a law passed just weeks ago, she now, along with millions of other women, have the opportunity to live on their own, especially if they see it fit. And when considering that Human Rights Watch reported on January 30th of 2019 that over 35% of women in Saudi Arabia had publicly announced they experienced domestic abuse, the majority of which coming from their fathers and brothers, it seems imperative that they only have opportunities to escape this violence, something that a law allowing them to live on their own without the guardianship of their father, someone who could potentially be committing the abuse, is finally allowing to happen, indicating that this law not only protects women's rights, but it also gives them a pathway out of violence, which could potentially save lives. Unfortunately, while here in the United States, it may be funny to joke about men who have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 divorces, the unfortunate reality is that in Saudi Arabia, they don't have that opportunity, especially not from the perspective of women. Because Saudi Arabia's government and statistical analysis for 2020 reports that there were 57,595 divorces in the country of Saudi Arabia in 2020. What's important to note is that this is a 19.5% increase from the number of divorces in 2019, indicating that women are trying to alleviate divorce issues, especially with domestic abuse from their newfound husbands. The problem is, as Insider News writes, on March 6th of this year, that oftentimes women are afraid to leave in a divorce, saying that they would have nowhere to go except to return home to their parents, who would be equally disappointed in them for having a divorce. And as the article furthers,
that newfound policies that were circulating Saudi Arabia at the time, which eventually got passed in June, would allow women to forego this problem because, following a divorce, they have the new opportunity to finally own a house and live alone, meaning they don't have to fear the ultimate reality of what may happen if they get a divorce. Instead, they could have a pathway out of the violence and not have to return home to even more. Now, it's really quite astonishing to think that a country that has finally just allowed women to live alone is a leader in women's rights in any regard. Unfortunately, that is the reality, and it's also the third reason why this newfound law is a definite step forward for women's rights, because it allows Saudi Arabia to set a precedent for international standards. As the 2019 winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Abhijit Banduri and Esther Duflo explain in their book Poor Economics, A Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty, that around the world, Saudi Arabia is not known for their equality or women's rights. What they are known for is showing that change can come in government, especially in a country where women's rights has been so heavily scrutinized that their own governmental policies have foregoed action and even disregarded them as being equivalent to their male counterparts. But as Amnesty International writes in their 2020 report on Saudi Arabia, that going forward, Saudi Arabia's newfound motions of allowing women to travel on their own gave them the opportunity to set standards for neighboring countries like Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain to finally show that they too can change. And it's never too late to establish rights for women, a notion that Saudi Arabia is finally pushing, and a notion that the international community can finally come together to move towards equality. So when returning to the question, is Saudi Arabia's law permitting women to live alone without approval of a male guardian a step forward for women's rights? The answer is undeniably yes, because this policy allows women to finally have a pathway out of violence. That can be explained by, first, escaping domestic violence. Then second, because they no longer have to fear divorce. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is it sets a standard for international action. So, while diversity in government may not come by different ages of the male counterpart, one thing is for sure, that this move towards equality and new laws passed in Saudi Arabia opens up a new notion for women's rights and can hopefully push the country into equality going forward.
Official time is 6:59. Okay, we are about to enter our cross-examination period. At the end of 1 minute, I'll do this. 1.5, I'll do this, and then this is stop. Is that okay with both of you?
Sounds great.
All right. If everybody is ready, I'm going to hit mute, and then you may begin.
Perfect.
Hi, Mark. Great speech.
Thank you.
Off the top, what's motivating Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to make the appearance of having women's rights in his country?
So it's undeniably a notion towards trying to get public support. After years of protests by women and some men, there's been calling of action for women's equality across the country and the world. It's undeniable that actions like this are finally suiting those protests in helping to make sure women have opportunities going forward.
All right, what's the makeup of Saudi Arabia's courts?
So Saudi Arabia's courts are undeniably, while starting to become equality, are very predominantly male. There's also some women coming into the higher courts, but nowhere near a 50-50 margin that equality would depict.
What about their law enforcement? Are there any women there?
So there are some women in law enforcement, but nowhere near enough to protect against these actions of domestic violence I mentioned in my first point, or violence stemming from divorce in the second point. Because even with female law enforcement, women are often taken to court, where the court system oftentimes presides with the men who can afford more lawyers and get equality in the judicial system.
All right, so how is this new law a step forward when the people enforcing the law are disproportionately biased towards men?
So I'm actually really happy you brought that up, because as I explained in my first point, following this international leadership by the reporter at the time, courts could no longer accept cases where domestic abusers like fathers could try their own daughters or wives in court for trying to live alone. So undeniably, since courts can no longer take this action, judges and lawyers simply can't argue against a case that doesn't exist.
On the issue of an international standard, you named two other countries, Iran and Iraq, who have similar laws in place. Given that the other 189 countries don't have these types of laws in place, wouldn't you argue that there was already an international standard before Saudi Arabia?
Sure, but as I mentioned in my third point, the progress is not the fact that the international community wants it. It's showing that there can be change in countries that have policies like this. The United States hasn't had policies like this in years. Neither has the European Union. So since Saudi Arabia, a country that does have these policies, can change, so can they.
Thank you, Mark. Great speech.
Thank you.
And thank you all for judging. Happy Juneteenth.
Our seventh speaker is here ready to perform. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you need time signals?
I am all good. I have a timer up on my screen.
Okay. If the judges are ready, I'm going to mute myself and then you may begin. I'll do the official time.
Okay, great. I'm just going to drop my question in the chat for everyone. And so Mark has it when he cross-exes me. Pull up the timer real quick. All right. It didn't take long for the conflict between Israel and Palestine that broke out in May to claim its first victim. As the New York Times of May 26, 2021 explains, his name was Bara al-Ghiabli, and he wasn't a Hamas fighter or rebel. He was a 5-year-old, a preschooler who managed to get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He, like thousands of others from Gaza, his hometown, are now facing significant humanitarian destruction. But at least they made it out. Unfortunately, that's why the Associated Press explains further on May 26th of 2021 that countries from around the Middle East have been forced to come together to try to find a solution for the crisis. With thousands of people not having access to food, water, or shelter, particularly the countries of Egypt and Jordan have taken it upon themselves to play a diplomatic role, not only supporting the rebuilding of Gaza, where thousands of homes have been demolished, but also trying to provide them with a lasting sense of peace. So considering that for the 77,000 people in Gaza who are homeless today, we ask the question, how can Egypt and Jordan best assist with rebuilding efforts in Gaza? The answer is that the countries need to focus on humanitarian advancements. This can be seen in 3 ways. First, by cooperating directly with the Palestinian Authority. Second, by working directly with local construction companies. And finally, by reviving Gaza's water infrastructure. All across the region, millions of people in the Palestinian area, as well as even in Israel, are in need of desperate humanitarian aid. Some estimates say it's up to 2.5 million people already. However, they need to get aid from the right places. That's why the first way in which Egypt and Jordan can help assist with rebuilding efforts in Gaza is by working directly with the Palestinian Authority to distribute humanitarian aid. The Palestinian Authority basically rivals Hamas, who is another major group of power in Palestine, because they're basically the two governments. One of them is legitimate and the other, well, is largely a terrorist organization. However, they do provide basic goods and services. The Washington Post of May 22nd, 2021 elaborates that in the lack of Palestinian Authority action within Gaza in particular, Hamas has taken it upon itself to become the main provider of things like food aid and shelter and security for people in Palestine in the region, thus making them a legitimate governing institution in the eyes of thousands. However, Egypt and Jordan need to ensure that the Palestinian Authority is the one providing aid, thus bolstering the legitimate government's legitimacy in order to try to help with rebuilding efforts. As the New York Times explains further in May 26th of 2021 in a separate article, that because Jordan in particular has strong ties with the president of the Palestinian Authority, as well as backing with nearly $500 million from Egypt, this wouldn't be a hard thing to accomplish. By directing specific humanitarian aid towards the Palestinian Authority, not only do they help address the needs of the 2.5 million people in crisis, but as the Council on Foreign Relations of June 15th, 2021 furthers, it might be the only chance to bring peace in the region by finally making the Palestinian Authority legitimate. The second way in which Egypt and Jordan can best assist with rebuilding efforts in Gaza is by working directly with local construction companies. Look, building back things like houses, schools, and hospitals is great. But what would be even better is if it created jobs for people in Gaza while doing so. As a Reuters news agency explains further on June 4th of 2021, so far, Egypt hasn't done this. Instead, what they're doing is sending Egyptian construction companies in particular to try to rebuild things in Gaza. And while that is certainly admirable, it's not enough. Al Jazeera News recommends in May of 2021 that as an alternative, people in Egypt and Jordan can focus their efforts towards Palestinian construction companies, specifically those that exist within Gaza. Although many of them have been destroyed, people there still have the tools and training necessary to be able to engage in construction efforts, something that would also generate thousands of jobs, particularly for young people in Gaza, something that they've been missing out on for years, and especially in these last few weeks. And that's something that not only helps in the short term, but also in the long term as well, by providing a sense of stability where people otherwise wouldn't have it at all. The third and final way in which Egypt and Jordan can best assist with rebuilding efforts in Gaza is by revamping Gaza's water infrastructure. The people of Gaza have lost a lot when it comes to their water in the last few weeks. That's unfortunately because, as ReliefWeb, one of the world's leading humanitarian network resources, explains further, in May of 2021, it's estimated that nearly 40% of people in Gaza have so far lost access to clean drinking water, in large part because 3 of their desalination plants were bombed during the conflict back in May. However, particularly Jordan has an opportunity to improve this situation by going with what they were already, literally until yesterday, about to do. The Jerusalem Post, an Israeli newspaper, explains further just yesterday that Jordan just now shut down their previous plans for a desalination plant on the Red Sea, which would have cooperated with Israel and provided water through trucks and other shipments to the Palestinian people, specifically within Gaza. That could have been something instrumental, not only in helping foster cooperation between Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, but also in providing helpful infrastructure and rebuilding Gaza from the ground up. And by taking this step, this could be a huge advancement for peace and diplomacy in the region. But Jordan needs to take that action first. So, for the people of all over the Middle East, today we ask the question, how can Egypt and Jordan best assist with rebuilding efforts in Gaza? The answer was that they need to change their humanitarian approach. First, by targeting aid towards the Palestinian Authority. Second, by hiring local construction companies. And finally, by emphasizing water infrastructure. Although people like that 5-year-old boy never should have died in this conflict, there are thousands of other stories just like his out there. But hopefully Egypt and Jordan can help them rebuild their lives from the ground up. All right, I had 707.
Well, I had 705. That's close enough.
I'll take that one. That's good.
Okay. Okay, so we are ready for the cross-examination period. You will be cross-examined by 3655. I will hold one finger up after 1 minute. This is a minute and a half, and this is stop. At that point, you just finish your sentence.
Perfect.
Okay. I'm going to mute myself, and then you may begin.
So congratulations on a great speech. However, I do have a couple of questions. So first, just an overarching question. Considering Egypt has already given $500 million, which you mentioned, to Gaza, what is the likelihood they'd be willing to further fund any efforts in the Gaza Strip going forward?
They haven't already given that money. That's the amount they pledged in the May summit with the United States Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken. They haven't necessarily sent that yet. That money's still waiting to be distributed. So all of these programs that I mentioned, including hiring Gazan construction companies, as well as improving humanitarian goods, would come out of that 500 million, which isn't an insignificant number.
Great. So now on to your first point. You mentioned that the overwhelming authority of the Palestinian government in relation to Hamas. The problem is considering that Hamas has constantly instigated efforts with Israel in the past couple of days even, what is the likelihood they'd ever concede peacefully to the Palestinian government, even with Jordan and Egypt's help?
Well, that's where the actually recent news of a possible Palestinian election comes into play. The Palestinian Authority leader even said he wanted to hold a new election. And originally they were slated to do it until the conflict with Israel back in May. However, Hamas is on the way out in Palestine, in large part because people don't like the group that constantly instigates conflict that leads to the death of thousands of their people. So I think Palestine has essentially sent a strong message to Hamas that they'd prefer a different leader in large part. and that includes the Palestinian Authority.
Sure. So now on to your second point. There's been a recent trend going on in the Gaza Strip where they fund reconstruction and then have to fund it again after destruction. What is the likelihood that any money going into the Gaza Strip is going to create long-term infrastructure considering these recent trends?
Well, those recent trends are contingent on the idea that there will continue to be significant military fallout between Gaza and Israel. However, as I mentioned in my third point in particular, things like water infrastructure can be a peace-building mechanism for the whole region. In fact, the Red Sea plan that Jordan originally had in place included Israel as a partner, illustrating that this isn't just about making temporary infrastructure there, it's also about building peace in the region.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, judges. Is everyone okay? Okay, then, thank you.